Hey everyone. So this video is about what it's like growing up as a first generation migrant, Southeast Asian migrant, in a Western nation like Australia. So quickly, a bit about myself. I'm from Myanmar, and I moved over to New Zealand when I was very young, as a baby, and and then lived in Australia for pretty much my whole life. So those two nations, New Zealand and Australia, both I guess you would call former colonies. Um, Typically Western culture, and so it's always been an interesting dynamic in terms of the relationship that I've had with that particular cultural context and my own cultural context. And I'm sure a lot of other people who are also first generation migrants can relate. Now, I guess let's start as a kid, right? Um, so, growing up, as most kids want to do, they want to just fit in. They don't really care about anything else but just having fun, making friends, and not being picked on. And so I guess like from an early age, probably around about 11 or 12, I as an insecure little Asian boy who was skinnier than most of the other boys in their grade and hit puberty a lot later. Um, I always had this need to prove that that I was white, and that would be you know anything from feeling insecure about the fact that I would get like spicy beef curry for lunch when all my friends had roll ups and jam sandwiches. Uh, and then another one would be, as a kid, you care about your looks as well. As you start to get more, you start to care more about popularity and girls. So I remember I would always like look at the models for when I was, shopping for clothes, and there'd always be like white dudes. And so subconsciously, I never really thought about it at the time, but subconsciously, I would always try and avoid the mirror because that would constantly remind me that actually, hey, you're not white. Um, you look Asian. And this kind of feeling would carry on all the way throughout high school as well, and especially like towards when you get to your later years in high school, and all you really think about as a young teen is just having sex, getting laid. Yeah, and so fast forward to university. I got into a relationship, um, and I felt way less insecure, and like that's completely arbitrary, right? Because it's like you go into a different cultural context, and it's completely normal to not talk to the opposite sex until you're ready for marriage. So it's all self imposed, but the uni is a really interesting time for a migrant because you're suddenly now surrounded by a lot more international people. But then you have to remember that university is this very like I would say awesome period, um, but you're still living in fantasy land because it's a period where you're technically an adult, but you're not expected to earn any money. And coming back to the fact that it's a far more international environment, when you leave uni, you start to realize the reason why it's because it's profitable for universities as a business, right? They typically tend to charge international students significantly more than they do charge their domestic citizens. And so those like when you're in that environment, obviously you're going to have more influences coming in on globalization, internationalism, equality, all that stuff, and you really start to believe like, oh, like things like conflicting heritage and all that kind of stuff, they don't really matter as much. But then when you leave uni and when you start to go into the real world and you start to having to take on responsibilities like financial responsibilities, you need to really reassess, I guess, the stability of your identity, because you don't have time to be unstable anymore. You have responsibilities of, your parents, money, potentially saving for a house, having kids, and so those things need to get sorted out. And then, if you're like me, you've most probably formed some fairly decent relationships. Like, I'm from Australia again, I've said it before. So if you're like me, you've probably formed some really good relationships with Australians. Um, and because, they're lovely people. Like, but you start to realize that, again, like, when you go through that period of becoming stable, forming an adult sense of identity, um, it's no longer sustainable to have one of your drivers for life to be trying to fit into a different cultural context. You have to embrace the realities of who you are and where you came from and what your preconditions were. Um, and so that can be a bit jarring for not just yourself but also your friends and especially your significant other as well, because they accepted you on the identity that you formed for yourself when you were in school and in uni and growing up. And so you kind of starting to rediscover who you are implicitly kind of forces them to go on that same journey with you. Um, and this is interesting, right? It's interesting for um, a long term relationship. For example, I've mentioned before now, like I have a girlfriend, and we've both kind of accepted the idea that this is going to be long term. Like she's Christian, she has beliefs on marriage and those value systems. And it's interesting because when you're in a intercultural relationship, you're exposed to situations and experiences that other people who aren't in an intercultural relationship aren't. Um, you know, for example, one of them can be like always just doubting, like, are you kind of putting the other person or yourself into a unsustainable environment? Will it work long term? Especially over the last year, I've been thinking about this a lot more, given the whole Israel-Palestine situation. You really start to see that it's one thing to have your social level, your social dynamics, talk about equality and internationalism and embracing each other no matter of where you come from. But then it's another thing to see the geopolitical power structures do complete opposite. And over the last year, when the atrocities have been committed against the Palestinian people, you start to see that all of those international institutions that championed human rights and all that stuff, they just don't have a systematic arm to enforce them. And then, so coming back to having an intercultural relationship, you start to really question, like, what are the assumptions that we've built this relationship off? Am I really just another kind of second class citizen that's being put here for economic purposes, right? And then you start to see the way that the media works as well, and how they kind of blur and obscure things when they want, and then they shine a light onto things that fit their political agenda. And so you think, like, if I'm going to stay here for long term in this country, am I going to be consistently subjected to that? Are how is it going to impact myself, but also my significant other? How is it going to impact our children in the future? And would we be having these problems if we were just dating or choosing to marry someone from the same relative cultural context, right? And so I guess the final point I wanted to make was on the topic of parents. So typically in Asian customs, it's quite normal to have your parents be the honor, right? And to take on the responsibility of looking after your parents. And growing up, I was always kind of like at odds with that idea because I was, again, trying to westernize and trying to make my parents kind of. I always thought they were too fob, which if you don't know what that means, it means fresh off the boat. It's a Kiwi and Australian term. Um, anyway, so yeah, I was always trying to get them to individualize and liberalize because that was what was normal in Australia. And so growing up though, as an adult, you start to realize that one of the firm realities is that your parents will never change fundamentally who they are. And if they're also decent parents, which they were, um, they are under no obligation to change either. So that's an interesting point of contention because when you're in a intercultural relationship, um, you you again start to kind of get into some interesting situations because on one hand, your parents have no obligation to change based on a decision that you made to get into a relationship with someone from a different cultural context. But on the other hand, you also have a commitment to your, if you're in a planned long term, eventually a marriage with a significant other. So thankfully, my parents were accepting. I know that that's not always the case for different migrant families, or just different families in general, right? But they were accepting. But what that also means, and no one will tell you this, but what this means is that implicitly you will not have 100% either one cultural context anymore, right? It's like if your significant other is from a different cultural background, then you're not going to be 100% of that, and you're also not going to be 100% of your own cultural background. So that uniquely positions you for the future, because if you have kids, if you're going through certain challenges in life, you don't always have that prior history or prior sense of identity to be able to fall back on, because you're in two different cultures coming together. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But because people have always been exposed to novel experiences throughout history, and you can deal with it and you can make it into a positive environment, but you are always going to be uniquely positioned. I guess that's the point. And then with your parents as well, in the future, you're always going to be thinking about, okay, how do we prioritize everything appropriately, and how do we make it true to the unique situation that you have. But yeah, anyway, I'm just rambling on now. And if you guys like this and you guys wanted to hear more or you can relate to things, let me know in the comments below. And or if you have anything else that you want me to talk about.